Where I wanted to start at this point is I went back to Arctic Bay in 2000. It was another project. That project is just completely and utterly, totally uninteresting. But going back to Arctic Bay in 2000 was an incredibly emotional experience for me. It was a very important experience, and a couple of things came out of it. One, most of the people that I had worked with had died by then. So Ananangwaha, Elizabeth had died by then. Arna Yumiak had died. So I was kind of dealing with the next generation down, and certainly the people who were kids when I was there, they were little kids, had now grown up and were adults. One of the sort of striking experiences was I was walking down the street one day in Arctic Bay, and this young 15-year-old guy comes up to me. Now, normally 15-year-old Inuit guys don't go up to strange white men and talk to them. Right, so he comes up to me and he says to me in Inuktitut, "Are you the white man who speaks Inuktitut?" I thought, well, if I didn't, this would be a problem. But I said, "Yes, I'm the white man that speaks Inuktitut." And he said, "Well, my mom and dad told me to come and say hi to you." I said, "Oh, okay. Who's your mom and dad?" So he told me who his mom and dad were, and I said, "Well, okay? Wait a minute now. Who your grandparents?" So he told me who his grandparents were. I said, "Well, that's really nice, but why did they tell you to come and say hi to me?" And he looked at me as if I'm a complete idiot. And he says, "I'm Arnau Yumiuk." So here is my closest friend, my best Inuktitut teacher. He was now a young 15-year-old guy. And of course, I was supposed to recognize him. I have never learned what the criteria are for recognizing when a name comes back, but here he was standing in front of me, and so that was incredibly moving for me to do that. And then I went over to see my brother Jaco at his house, and when I walked in, Jaco just started crying, and we stood and we hugged each other and we cried. And he said to me, "Chris," he said, "seeing you come back and seeing you come in to visit reminds me so much of the times we had together with our mother." And then he turned around and his young teenage daughter walks in, and he said, "Chris, here's our mother," because she had, of course, the name. So it was extremely moving to me and people expected me to know and understand, and I did know and understand. I just didn't know who had what names at that point, but that people expected me to understand that, to know what the significance of this was. It was one of the things that Arnar Yumiuk once said to me. I didn't include it as part of the story, but my father died just before I went and did my field work. And one of the little mementos I had from my father was a Swiss Army pocket knife, which I carried with me because that's one of my memories of my father. Well, in Arctic Bay, some kid stole it. It disappeared one day. And I was telling Arnar Yumiuk how upset I was that my pocket knife from my father had been stolen. And I always remember this. Arnar Yumiuk turned to me and said, "That is so much like a white man." I said, "How?" He said, "Well, in a white man, you remember the dead through a material object, through an object." And then he picked up this little girl and he said, "But we remember our dead through human beings, and I know that this little girl is my wife." Because his wife had died. The little girl had the name. And he said, that tells you the difference between white men and Inuit. And I thought, that's a very powerful statement. And that came back to me when I met Arnar Yumiuk and when I met my mother. But the other thing that happened in that trip to Arctic Bay, which became critical, and which is where the book that I've just finished writing starts, is I was visiting a woman. I'm not going to give her a name at this point, but I was visiting a woman. And this woman I had never got along with when I was in Arctic Bay before. In fact, we were mutually quite antagonistic to one another. We really didn't like each other. But she had mellowed, and I guess I had mellowed over the years. And so she and I were sitting and talking one afternoon. We were having tea one afternoon. I was actually there accidentally because I'm colorblind, and I went into the wrong house because I didn't know which house it was. Anyway, we were sitting having tea, And she started telling me this story. And she said that she was in her kitchen one day making bannock and kneading the bannock, and there was flour all over the place. And she said, and suddenly the bannock, the flour all went into the pot where she'd been kneading the bannock, and the flour came off her hands. And she realized that she had risen up off the floor, and she was standing a foot or so above the floor. And she turned and she looked out her window towards the mountain on the other side of Arctic Bay, and there's a series of stairs going up through the clouds. So she went up the stairs through the clouds, and she met with Jesus and had a conversation with Jesus. And Jesus gave her some advice on how to actually how to deal with her marriage. And then she came back down the stairs and finished making the bannock. And she looked at me and she said, "Well, so what do you think of that?" And I was a little bit nonplussed, but I decided I was going to shed my usual skepticism, and gave her some sort of fairly positive and encouraging words about it. But the thing that struck me immediately was this story is almost identical to the 1947 story of Ikumuk going up to visit Jesus. The story is reproducing in, well, this is 2 generations down, but is reproducing through the activities of these people. What is it about this kind of event? What is it about this kind of encounter? What is it about this kind of story that is so important here? In further conversation, it came out that she was very much engaged in part of the Pentecostal church in Arctic Bay at that time, and so that was, that was led to a further discussion and further questions. But it really the how do we say, the tapestry that I had woven in Rapture and the Rupture suddenly had a new panel on it. The story is continuing; it's not over, and so that has led me into thinking about really when the missionaries came and when the missionaries imposed their kind of a colonial model of Christianity. That didn't stick necessarily, and that the narrative, the story that started back in 1919, 1921 with the Kumalik and with Umik and with all of those movements that took place, is actually an ongoing story, and the people today are continuing to act in that story, despite whatever may have happened with the missionaries. And so that story, and the fact that it so clearly resonates with the 1947 or 1946 events, that story really made me start thinking about, okay, so what is this overarching narrative, and where does it go, and how does it fit? I think that there's a political story that needs to be told. I said this before, that this is a political statement on the part of Inuit trying to assert independence and control over their own lives in the colonial situation. So I think that's really quite important. But I'm not sure how all of it works. So that was I think for me one of the most important encounters in that particular trip. It was a fairly short trip, but and it was also really remarkable because 2 days later I was also visiting the same woman. This time, sort of the rest of the family was there, the kids and her husband and various other parts, and we got into a discussion. And they were talking about their grandfather, and at one point they said, our grandfather had 4 wives. And I'm thinking back to all the genealogical work I'd done, right? So I knew the genealogies pretty well, and I'm thinking, I don't remember him having 4 wives. So I said as much. I said, I only remember your grandfather having so-and-so as their wife. Oh, yeah, but he had 3 invisible wives on the land. Now, the vocabulary, the Inuktitut vocabulary got a bit out of my reach at that point, and so I had to get them to explain what they were talking about. But yes, indeed, he had 4 wives, 3 of whom were invisible wives on the land. Well, I'd never got into a conversation with this crowd over this kind of topic before, which launched us into a sustained entire afternoon discussion on shamanism and some of the various aspects of shamanism and their understanding of it. It's those conversations are not always easy to start, and once you get into them, they're fascinating conversations. I also do have to tell you one thing, which is an absolute disgrace. I'm a terrible anthropologist. My first time in Arctic Bay, I was quite assiduous initially about taking notes. And one day I was working with Kamenik and talking to Kamenik about something, and Kamenik said, "Put down your pen, put down your paper." He said, "Listen to what I have to say and understand it." So I have the most awful field notes in the whole world. I have virtually nothing. And every interesting conversation I've ever had, I don't have a tape recorder, I don't have a notebook. When I go and people are going to look into my archive, there's not going to be a whole lot there. And if you read it, you're going to go, "This is the most boring stuff I've ever read in my entire life." Of course, I had no notebook with me the day that I spent an entire afternoon sitting with this family discussing all kinds of aspects of shamanism. Never got a chance to write down the vocabulary and stuff like that, because by the time I got home and wrote whatever I could remember down, those kind of details are gone. Really interesting, though, that at the same time that you're getting this conversation about going up to heaven and visiting Jesus, the same people are willing to engage in a fairly intense discussion, and the Pentecostals on top of it, intense discussion about shamanism, and it didn't have the usual, that was bad stuff in the old. No, that's horrible stuff. It was, this is what happened, kind of thing. So it was quite an interesting experience, and it was gratifying that in some ways that going back to Arctic Bay, not only did people remember me, but that they had an expectation that I had a certain level of knowledge and understanding, which they could assume. So, by this time, by 2000, I had moved to the University of Manitoba. I was in the Native Studies Department at the University of Manitoba. And in the year 2000, we hired a new person to come in as the head of the department, a guy called Peter Kolchiski. And when Peter arrived as head of the department, he went around and met with each of the members of the department and talked about our dreams and aspirations and whatnot. So I was sitting talking to Peter, and Peter said to me, "See, Chris," he said, "I've been running this program in Pangnirtung for the past 3 years." He said, "It's perfect for you." He said, "I want you to do this with me." He said, "I want you to run this program in Pangnirtung with me." And the program was basically, we took roughly 20 to 25 students up to Pangnirtung. I think the best way is to use Peter's language. We taught them about Inuit cultural politics, which involved all kinds of stuff. But anyway, 2001, it's going to be my first year going to Pangnirtung, working with Peter on this program. Well, it so happened that Peter's girlfriend at the time was pregnant, and she gave birth to the baby the day before the program started. So the night before the program started, Peter phones me up and says, "Chris, it's all yours. I'll meet you up in Pangnirtung in a month, but we've just had a baby and we got to deal with this baby. So you take it over." Well, I'd never been to Pangnirtung before in my life. I didn't know anybody. I had no idea how to run this program. I was working with Steph McLaughlin, who, like me, Stephen never had anything to do with Inuit. He was an environmental science teacher. And we were working with Melissa Hood, Melissa was the program coordinator. She had been on the program the year before, and she knew a fair bit, but that was it. So there am I with Steph and Melissa taking off to Pangnirtung with 25 students and frankly not a clue what I was doing. Anyway, we got there. Things happened. A lot of things happened. But one of the important things that happened, of course, is I do speak Inuktitut. Now, I will make it clear, I am not fluent in Inuktitut, but I'm competent in Inuktitut, and I can easily carry on conversations and do things in Inuktitut. And when I get into trouble in Inuktitut, it's usually quite hilariously funny, and the Inuit have a good time with it. But I can work in Inuktitut. So the first thing the folks in Pangnaktuk wanted to know was, where did you learn to speak Inuktitut? So I told them I learned in Arctic Bay, Ikpiaryo. And they had a bit of fun with that because the dialect is different. And from a Pangnaktuk point of view, I kind of spoke a, hick rural backwater dialect, like, who talks like that except for those, those ignorant people up in the north kind of stuff. They had a lot of fun with that. Of course, it's just a dialect difference. But one of the things that happened is Jaco Ishulutak came up to me and he said, where did you learn to speak Inuktitut? I said, Arctic Bay. He said, did you know my uncle Kakasik? Oh, no, did you know Kakasik? And I said, well, yeah. I said, I know Kakasik because Kakasik's my uncle. And he said, how's he your uncle? I said, well, my adopted mother, Ananangwaha, had 3 husbands, and her second husband was Uyaghaluk, and Uyaghaluk's older brother, or younger brother, I guess. Uyaghaluk's brother, in any case, was Kakasik, so Kakasik's my uncle. And he looked at me and he said, well, Kakasik's my uncle. I said, well, how's Kakasik your uncle? Well, it turned out, of course, that particular family, there were 3 brothers and a father and mother. That particular family had been brought from Pangnaktuk to Arctic Bay in 1930-something or rather, 1936, I guess, and had stayed in Arctic Bay. It turned out that my brother Jaco Tungrok, is named after the father, the grandfather, the father of this whole crowd. So that meant, of course, you've already done the arithmetic, that Jaco and I are cousins. From then on, he called me Idlugulu. Now, Idlugulu in Inuktitut means my poor, pathetic cousin. It's not terribly polite, but it's not terribly rude either. And I always called him Idlugulu. So that meant that I now had a cousin in Pangnaktuk. Over the years, Jaco and I became very, very close friends. We did a lot of things together. And in fact, he taught me an amazing amount of things, and we can talk about that a bit later. But so I then was related to a fairly substantial chunk of Pangnaktuk. The other person we worked with was a guy called Joannesi Kapik. Joannesi would have been in his late 60s at that point. He's now older. He's still alive. And he was sort of the teaching elder in our program. And the third person we worked with was Eviana Iliak. And she was she was mom. Evie has to be one of the she just died a month ago. She just died. She has to be one of the kindest, most generous, warmest people I've ever met in my entire life. She was absolutely phenomenal. She, of course, taught us all the women's things, but she also just sort of generally looked after us. And so, I remember one time I got sick. There was a flu going around amongst the students, a horrible stomach flu, where you'd be vomiting all night. And I could feel this coming on, and I thought, oh no, the last thing I want is to be trying to run this program and to be sick. And I told Evie that I wasn't feeling well and that I thought this was coming on. And Evie said, right, okay, I'll deal with this. I thought, uh-oh. Off she goes, and she makes up a plate of boiled ujuk, boiled bearded seal, for me, and sits me down and says, okay, you eat that plate of boiled ujuk. And I can tell you the last thing I wanted to do was eat a plate of boiled ujuk. I mean, I just looked at it, I'm going, Anyways, I did as I was told, because you always do as you're told with Evie. I did as I told. I ate this plate of boiled ujuk, and she said, no, you go to bed. So went to bed. I sweated it the whole night and woke up the next morning absolutely fine, no problem whatsoever. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to listen to her in the future. I did discover that most Inuit curing involves fairly large quantities of seal oil, either applied internally or externally. And so that was one of the major things. But those are the three. So Jaco, Joanna C., and Evie were the people that we primarily worked with in Pantotok. And I think we can go on and talk a little bit more about what I learned from them. Well, I think we're going to stop here and start again on thinking about what they taught.